World Space Week is observed from October 4th to 10th every year. The UN declared day commemorates the launch of Earth's first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, on 4th October 1957, as well as to observe the signing of the historical treaty for peaceful use of outer space on 10th October 10 years later in 1967. The theme this year was space and sustainability, inspiring focus on the challenges the world faces to keep space safe and sustainable. Given the development of technology and space exploration, rapid militarization, the growing distrust among nations, and the race for space supremacy already indicate the growing concern and the urgency around space sustainability. So can the modern space race be built around sustainability? That's the global debate. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Teena. Pleased to welcome on this edition of the Global Debate an illustrious panel of experts who are joining us from different parts of the world. Glad to have Ms. Courtney Wenbaum, Senior Management Scientist at the RAND Corporation, Dr. Brian Whedon, Director of Program Planning, Secure World Foundation, and Group Captain Ajay Lele, retired. He's a consultant at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program. Ms. Wenbaum, let me begin the program today with you. You know, until a few decades ago, space superiority meant the United States of America and the erstwhile USSR, until the advent of China and the rapid progress that China has made in terms of carrying out space activity. Can we say that the world today is witnessing a new race to space?
I think that the environment has certainly changed. First, thank you very much for having me here tonight. It's a pleasure to be with you all. There's been a lot of changes since the Cold War of the USSR and the US. In addition to China being, of course, a major actor in space, we also have now the commercialization of private space travel. I mean, now if you have enough money, if you're a billionaire, you can ride your own rocket. And those trips are going to start getting longer than just 5 minutes. You're going to start to see probably longer travels, you know, the interest in space tourism, maybe other kinds of space stations. So yes, China absolutely has entered the stage, but it's not only China. It's become much more complex as the technologies have proliferated and more nation states as well as non-state actors have access to this capability.
Dr. Whedon, so multiple factors contributing to the space today getting contested and also congested. How do you see this impacting the long-term sustainability of space?
Well, that is really the question of our time. As Courtney hinted at, there's a lot more players in space, both many more governments operating in space, as well as now new commercial actors. And they're doing things in space for not only military activities, collecting intelligence, but also selling things and providing services that are being used around the globe. Just in the last few years, we've gone from maybe 1,500 or so functional satellites in orbit to now more than 5,000. And that number is set to grow again by another order of magnitude, likely in the next decade. So we're seeing many more satellites, many more people, many more uses of space. And so on the one hand, that is a challenge of itself for the congestion of all of those things operating. But now we have a renewed military competition that has a space element between the US and China, but also we don't forget Russia is involved as well with what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. And so that opens up this added complexity of potentially conflicts on space extending, conflicts on Earth extending into space, and the potential for satellites being directly attacked, which could just make the sustainability question all that much more challenging.
Absolutely. And Captain Lele, militarization is something that has security implications. Before we come to how it impacts India, a quick question on the current geopolitical context. In the wake of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, do you think the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war has brought back the focus on the concerns of the existing war extending beyond land, sea and air into space, and the urgent need for the world to actually put a check on weaponization of space?
I think it's too early to take the war to the outer space. if you really look at it after the Crimea conflict, still there was a good amount of friendship, if I'm using a correct word, between the US and the Russia. You had the International Space Station working perfectly all right after the Crimean crisis. There was an engine which was required for US to send their spy satellites out into the space. They were importing it from Russia. So there were indications that in spite of you are having conflict on the Earth, the conflict is not reaching to the space. But immediately after the Ukraine war started, there were a certain amount of statements which came from Russia, particularly talking of taking the war to the next level. But subsequently, the person who was heading Russian Space Agency has been removed. And right now, initially, there were indications that Russia is very keen to get out of the International Space Station by 2024. But now there are indications that they would like to continue. I think it appears that Russia understands that unnecessarily taking the war to that level may not be a very prudent idea. And as far as space race is concerned, I think that is actually a Cold War era construct. I don't want to give a value judgment whether there is a war between US and China, but I would like to just give some statistics. There are around 5,000 operational satellites in the world, out of which 3,000 satellites belong to the United States of America, and China has got around 500 satellites. The space budget of NASA is around $55 billion, and the space budget of China, as per the available information, is around $10 billion. So there is a lot amount of a talk of a space race, but actually, if you really look at the statistics, I think NASA is quite ahead of everybody in the world.
Dr. Whedon, why are then concerns that China may outspace United States when it comes to space supremacy? There's been a report recently in the month of August. Perhaps the Pentagon has also expressed its concerns. There's been experts have been talking about how China has been aggressively pursuing space activity. So be it in terms of space exploration, commercial exploitation, or even space militarization. The aggressive stance that China has adapted over the last few years, it may see that it may outperform the United States in the next couple of years.
So I think it's coming from two sources. One, China is absolutely investing in space and is making a lot of advancements across both civil space activities with its human spaceflight program, and now has its first space station on orbit. It has a Mars probe, a Mars lander, and it is building out a whole different sets of military space capabilities. And I think what the U.S. military is concerned about is the relative gap between the United States space capabilities and China's is shrinking, and China is also developing a set of counter space or anti-satellite capabilities that can threaten US satellites or those of other countries. So there absolutely is something to be concerned about. But the United States is still ahead in several key areas. And as AJ pointed out, spends the most money on space, has the most satellites, and still has at least somewhat of an advantage. The other reason I think you're seeing this is there are people in the United States who are trying to use the threat of China to encourage more funding, more spending, more focus on space within the United States. And so I think that has to be taken into account a little bit when you see some of the discussions and some of the domestic in the U.S. Concern about some of these issues.
Captain Lele, before I go across to Ms. Bainbaum, a quick question on concerns not just within America, also in India, particularly with the aspect of space militarization. So as China builds up its military capability in space, it is a concern for India as well. What kind of security implications could it have for us? And how are we preparing ourselves to counter such threats?
I think definitely there is a concern for India because US has gone to an extent of creating a separate vertical of a particular domain of a space where they now have what are their own space vertical from a military aspect. If you really look at Chinese track record in the counter space capabilities, they are making significant amount of investments towards developing various counter space capabilities. And I think that is a cause of concern both for India as well as for the United States. As far as the United States is concerned, for them, Russia is also a concern. I think as far as India is concerned, China is a major concern. And that is one of the reasons, just to give an indication to develop certain amount of a deterrence mechanism, India has also undertaken an anti-satellite test. China did an anti-satellite test in the year 2027. India did it in 2019. The aim of India for creating a space architecture from a military point of view is very important. As far as India is concerned, India is not looking at weaponization of space or looking at another dimension of a warfare out into the space. But India feels, particularly learning lessons from 1991 Gulf War, that space is extremely important component as far as the development of a military architecture is concerned. And that's the reason India is making investments into satellites, which are essentially communication satellites. We had launched a satellite in the year 2013 for Indian Navy. Then a few years back, we had launched a dedicated satellite for Indian Air Force. So we are looking at aspects which are related with military advantages, what we call in a military parlance as a force multiplier. When we are talking of Chinese investments, their investments are more towards weaponization of space. That's why they are developing a lot amount of counter space capabilities. So there is a subtle difference between India's investments, which are more towards military part of it, and as far as China's investments are concerned, they are more towards weaponization part.
Okay, Ms. Wenbaum, so when we talk about on one side is space exploration for development, like what India is doing. On the other side is weaponization of space to perhaps have space superiority and to have an advantage when it comes to warfare. So if we look at the key players today in this race to supremacy for space, where do these sides stand on the aspect of space exploration, on the aspect of militarization?
This is an important question, and I'm glad you asked it. I think one of the key elements of China that we have not yet discussed is that, unlike in the US, China makes no distinction between its civil agencies and its military agencies. It has no civil agencies. All of its government supports the PLA and works towards the PLA. Therefore, any activities that China is doing in space have a military component. Unlike in the US, we have NASA. Other countries have civil agencies with no military authority. That's not true in China. So part of these concerns that you described from the Pentagon or that AJ described from New Delhi are related to the fact that in China, all space exploration is militarized exploration. Now, when we take that dynamic and we overlay it with some of the writings coming out of Chinese military scholars, we see that some Chinese military scholars and analysts are writing things like, whoever controls space controls the earth. There's this belief that space is the new high ground for China. There's also been talk in China about a national rejuvenation vis-a-vis space, and that space is going to be the gateway to some national rejuvenation for China. So for China, space means something very, very different than it means for many other countries, including India and the US. And I think this is where some of these concerns come from non-Chinese observers that are trying to understand where exactly is China going, what are their intentions, what are their end goals here.
Dr. Whedon, so this was of course about the tussle for space supremacy that we are perhaps witnessing. But when we talk about the larger aspect, and this is concerning the entire world, we just observed the World Space Week with the theme sustainability and space. Are sustainability of space and security of space one and the same thing? What are countries, organizations doing to ensure long-term sustainability of space given the multiple challenges that we face today?
Well, I'm not sure they're the same thing, although they are absolutely related. And I think they are in tension somewhat. So I mentioned there are a whole set of sustainability challenges just stemming from the non-military use of space. And then there's another additional set of challenges coming from the military use of the space. When it comes to the non-military things, there have been many discussions for the last 15 years or so on minimizing the amount of orbital debris that is left in orbit or that is created by just normal space activities. Things like, removing satellites from space when they're reached the end of life, like making sure that they don't explode just by themselves randomly. There's been quite a lot of focus at the international level on doing those things. And we're seeing, I would say, a relatively good progress in dealing with those. The new challenge we have is the initiation of large constellations of satellites that are now measuring thousands and may sometime in the next few years measure tens of thousands of satellites. And there's a lot of concerns over whether or not we can keep those satellites from colliding with each other, as well as colliding with other pieces of debris, and what that means for things like radio frequency spectrum use and interference and a whole host of other issues. So there's also a lot of discussions going on about how to minimize the risks coming from that. And then finally, going to the military side of things, this year, the United Nations started up what's called an open-ended working group on space threats. And there are dozens of countries participating in those discussions, talking about what they see as major threats to space, whether those are to their own satellites or how things in space could threaten the Earth. And they're starting to talk about what might be done about those threats. Now, it's still relatively early in the process. These meetings are supposed to run across this year as well as 2023. There's still quite a lot of disparity. On the one hand, you have Russia and China that are arguing for a treaty that is banning the weaponization of space and banning the placement of weapons in space. On the other hand, you have the United States and many Western countries that are calling for the establishment of voluntary norms of behavior to deal with certain types of activities that they feel are threatening or could, undermine the sustainability space, such as destroying satellites through anti-satellite testing. And it's unclear how this whole discussion is going to come out in the end.
Ms. Benbaum, the question here is, are the countries just talking or actually doing something about it? Because what we have seen is over the last 2 years, since the pandemic began, sustainability has been pushed back. And then, of course, as a fallout of the Russia-Ukraine war, geopolitical tensions have taken center stage. And all of these, SDGs and the larger ambition of protecting our planet, of saving our planet, and these sustainable goals have been something that countries have only been talking about, but doing very less about it.
Absolutely. I mean, you raised the point that space doesn't exist independent of all the other areas of society. That we have environmental challenges on Earth, we have global stability problems on Earth, and you're right, these all affect what's going to happen in space, how countries will invest, what capabilities they'll go after. I think one of the areas that we've seen the potential for progress, I say potential, we'll see what happens, is that there seems to be an international desire by many countries, not all, to have space be much more like a stable domain, that it's just always available for use by those who need it when they do. When there's a natural disaster, countries want access to weather forecasting technology. They want access to imagery that would help them figure out where do we send first responders after an earthquake, a tsunami, a flood. There's an international need for space for very peaceful humanitarian reasons. And I think that what we're seeing as stability crises happen, like Ukraine, is this call from other participants and actors that, wait a minute, let's not make space a battleground. Let's make space something that all of society, all of humanity has access to because it benefits all of us equally. And the destabilization of space hurts all of us, maybe not equally, maybe even some people disproportionately.
That's right. Captain Lele, because the fact a number of developing countries who've been talking about sustainability, long-term sustainability of space, have actually not been doing enough. There are reports which say that countries have invested heavily into military space capabilities that have no sustainability provision in their space operations or any of these programs. So the question here is, when we talk about having a secure, safe and sustainable space, the challenges are many, actions are very less on the ground in practicality. This is going to remain. What is the need of the hour?
I think at this point in time, one must understand that in spite of all these debate on heavy militarization and all that, almost more than 95% of the space is used for social development, education, telemedicine and other purposes. One must understand that unless and unless you don't start glamorizing the entire debate of a militarization of the space, you're not going to achieve something which is very sustainable out into the space. because there are various other aspects of a space which demand a very critical attention. Now, space tourism is coming out in a big way. The commercialization of a space is going to new heights. Even smaller countries like India have started a startup infrastructure as far as making investments return to the space. So, world is looking at a space as a emerging major global industry, and that also one has to keep it in mind. All these other aspects of a space are important, but there is a need to look at aspects like space traffic management. Today, your low Earth orbit is getting totally cluttered. The future of the internet, people are saying that lies out into the space with small satellites. But is it going to be a very reliable factor? Because your astronomical organizations have already started complaining that the visibility aspects are there. Then there are issues like space situational awareness, and there are various other issues which requires international collaborations. Right now, what happens is that there is no transparency as far as activities out into the space are concerned. Then there will be issues, not in this decade, maybe after a couple of decades, about the management of a space resources also. So military aspects of the space are getting certain amount of the visibility, but at the same time, one must understand that there are very other critical, important issues which requires more attention. And for that purpose, you require to have a global international mechanism which is acceptable to all. There have been a lot amount of efforts a couple of years back by pushing ideas like having a space code of conduct. China, Russia has put a treaty mechanism out into the space. To my mind, there is a very less debate is happening on all these aspects, which will eventually make space more sustainable. So there is a need to give push to all these aspects, and other dimensions of the space also needs more amount of attention.
Absolutely agree, Captain. But what about threats emanating from countries whose sole objective is to ensure space dominance? Can they pose threat to developmental space activities of countries?
I do not think so, because today, if you really look at a growing space market, there are a lot of smaller countries who are keen to make investments into the space from a perspective of the use for the space for societal purposes. You've got a climate change threat which is at the door, which is actually we are seeing a lot amount of activities happening in form of increasing tropical cyclones, hurricanes, and all that. So people do understand that space is important for all these aspects, and militarization aspect only should not be looked at. Yes, there are challenges with countries like China and Russia, but beyond that, you got few other countries which need to be looked at seriously, like Iran. You got to look at North Korea space program also. So all these countries need to be looked seriously, but one can't only try to focus attention on these aspects and try to deviate the attention for the more requirement of a space, which is more for peaceful purposes.
Okay. Mr. Whedon, coming to you, because we've been talking about, and the focus this year of the Space Week has been on sustainability. I want to understand from you, are there any guidelines that regulate the long-term space sustainability? And do we see a majority of countries worldwide actually ratifying such regulations if they exist?
That is a very difficult question. So there are indeed guidelines for the long-term sustainability of space. They were developed by the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space between 2010 and 2018. They were endorsed by all 100 countries of that committee. However, they are voluntary in nature. They call upon countries to adopt certain national policies, to adopt certain practices, to put in place things at the national level, but at the international level, they are voluntary. We have seen a growing number of countries moving to adopt those sustainability guidelines. And for the last couple of years, there are sort of annual reports coming out of many countries on how they are doing. But it is an incremental process. And again, it is up to countries to do them themselves. As I would say, in terms of how are we actually doing, we're doing okay. There is some progress. But unfortunately, as we've talked about here, I think the challenges are getting more difficult faster than we're seeing some progress. As I mentioned, we've been talking about sort of how to mitigate the creation of orbital debris. All of those discussions took place before we had large constellations on orbit. And now there's a new challenge that we have to face. And of course, there is this lingering concern that if there is a future conflict between the US and Russia, or between the US and China, or between other countries that have significant space capabilities, that there's going to be a portion of that conflict taking place in space, potentially destruction of satellites. And that could have widespread, very negative implications for everyone, as AJ has outlined. So that's the real concern. And at the moment, there's not an agreement on what to do about that challenge.
Absolutely. Ms. Benbaum, I'll take one last question from you. The bottom line here is that sustainability is only, at the cusp of becoming actionable. So outside of multilateral efforts, is there anything that other organizations who've been involved with this, area can do to promote space sustainability?
Absolutely. One of the areas that's come out of research is that the more that that the entire world, not just governments, but large organizations are relying on space, the more intermingled our space systems and capabilities are with the rest of society, the more incentive there is to keep it peaceful. So, I'll use an example from the cyber domain. About 15 years ago, if we were doing this program about cyber supremacy, cyber attacks, we'd be worried about risks of attacks against major stock markets. That was a huge fear 15 years ago, is that a nation state would attack the global financial markets, and we haven't seen it happen. And not only have we not seen it happen, but we've pretty much seen that no country would ever want to pull that trigger, that doing so would create so much economic pain to themselves that it's not worth the cost. Space is going to go in that direction pretty soon. The whole of society and humanity is going to be so dependent on space that it's going to be against any country's interests to truly destabilize it. The pain they would feel themselves immediately, as well as from the entire international community and all of the human race, would be so strong that it would just go against their interest to do it. So I do think that the more that we all become dependent on the space domain, the better insurance it is against the sort of risks that you're talking about.
That's right. So that having been said, I'll have to wind up the program. Thank you once again to all our guests for joining us on this edition of the Global Debate, sharing your perspectives with us and our viewers. Absolute pleasure to have all three of you on Sansad TV. So that's it from us, viewers, on this edition of the Global Debate this week. I'll see you same time next week. Until then, you take good care of yourselves and keep watching Sansad TV.